The truck I was driving wasn't mine, and that may have been the one honest accident in an otherwise deliberate story. My truck was in the shop, so I'd borrowed Beau's old Silverado, dull silver, a little rust along the wheel wells, and I pulled into my own driveway at 11:30 on a Tuesday like a stranger visiting his own life. Claudia's Volvo was there, which was strange because she never came home for lunch. Beside it sat a black BMW 5 Series I didn't recognize. I didn't think much of it at first. A client maybe, or someone from her firm. I was only stopping to grab a set of blueprints I'd left on the kitchen counter. The front door was unlocked. I stepped into the entryway, blueprints already in my head, and that's when I saw them. On the couch in my own living room. My wife of 7 years with her hands in another man's hair and his mouth on her neck, both of them so absorbed they didn't hear the door. I stood there for a moment that felt longer than it was. Took stock of it the way you take stock of a job site when something's gone badly wrong. Not panicking, just reading the damage. "Claudia," I said, just her name. She pulled away so fast she nearly fell off the cushion. The man, younger than me by 15 years, dark suit, the kind of haircut that costs too much, sat up slowly. He had the audacity to look annoyed. "Rex, this isn't," Claudia started. "Don't," I said. He stood and straightened his jacket with the composure of a man accustomed to difficult rooms. He was a lawyer named Darian, a junior partner at Claudia's firm, who'd been in our house before under the pretense of working through a case file over dinner. A guest I'd fed, a man I'd shaken hands with. "I think you and I should talk," he said to me, levelly. I looked at him for a long moment. 14 years as an Army Ranger teaches you to read a room fast. He was trying to control the situation, trying to speak first so he could frame what I'd just seen. "You have 60 seconds to get out of my house," I told him. "After that, I'm not going to be polite about it." Something in my voice, or maybe in the way I was standing, made the composure crack. He picked up his jacket from the armchair, nodded once at Claudia, like they had an understanding I wasn't part of, and walked past me to the door. I watched him back the BMW out of my driveway and disappear down the street. Then I turned back to my wife. She was standing in the middle of the living room with her arms crossed over her chest, not quite crying, but close. She looked like she was calculating something. "Rex, I'm sorry," she said. "I need you to understand." "Not today," I said. "Get your things together. I'll be out back." I spent the rest of that afternoon in the detached garage, sitting on a workbench with a can of Coke going warm in my hand, listening to the wind come off the Rockies. By evening, her car was gone. I'd thought I was calm, but later that night I noticed I'd cracked the bench vise without realizing it. People who meet me now sometimes assume I've always lived this way. The house in the foothills, the company with 47 employees. The truck that's always clean because someone else keeps it that way. They don't know about the 2 winters in Casper, Wyoming with no working furnace. They don't know about counting out exact change for school lunch and hoping nobody watched. My father went into the Dietz No. 6 mine on a Tuesday morning when I was 10 and didn't come back. The collapse took 3 men. My mother held on 5 more years before cancer found her. I was 15 when she died, and by then there wasn't much left in me that believed life was supposed to be fair. My Uncle Chet was her older brother. He ran a hardware store on the edge of town and didn't have much use for sentiment. He took me in because family meant something to him, even when it was inconvenient. He never said he loved me. Instead, he taught me how to repair a water heater, how to lay down floor tile, how to square a door frame that's gone crooked over winter. Years later, I understood that was the same thing. The Army straightened out the rest. I enlisted at 18, and inside of 2 years I was in Ranger training, which broke me down and rebuilt me in a configuration I hadn't known was possible. I served 14 years. The man who mattered most was my commanding officer, a colonel named Ashford, out of Portland, Oregon, with a dry sense of humor and a habit of saying more with fewer words than anyone I've ever known. He treated me like I was worth believing in before I'd given him much evidence. He argued with a general on my behalf once. He wrote letters to the Army Education Office when I mentioned I was thinking about a degree someday, like the thing was already decided. The colonel died in 2004 in Afghanistan, in a vehicle that rolled down an embankment on a road that had been cleared but wasn't. The news came over the phone, and I sat down on the floor of my apartment in Colorado Springs and didn't move for a long time. I came out of the service 2 years later and started from scratch. A pickup truck, a contractor's license, and a stubbornness I must have inherited from both parents in equal measure. I built it into a company, Colby Construction and Development, with my business partner Beau McCready. Headquartered in Denver, with projects stretching up to Fort Collins. By the time I met Claudia at a charity auction 8 years ago, I was doing well enough to bid on things I didn't need just to have something to do with my hands. She was sitting 2 tables over in a red dress, raising her paddle with the quiet confidence of someone who wins things regularly. 41 to my 46, a litigator at one of Denver's top firms, sharp and composed. I spent most of the auction watching her instead of the items. She gave me the kind of look when I finally walked over that said she'd already done the math on me. We were married a year later. For a while, I believed it was the best decision I'd made outside of the Army. I called Bo that evening and told him I wouldn't be in the next morning. He asked one question. I gave him one answer. He said, "I'm sorry, Rex," and left it there. That's why Bo is still my partner after 12 years. The following morning, I drove downtown to see my attorney, Sherwood Haig, a compact, methodical man in his 60s, who had been practicing family law longer than I'd been out of Wyoming. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, then sat back in his chair. "How much does she know about your business structure?" "Enough," I said. "She's a lawyer. She knows what questions to ask." "We'll move quickly then." He pulled out a legal pad. "What do you want the outcome to look like?" I stared out his office window. Fair, clean, done. "And the man?" I thought about Darian's easy posture on my couch, the way he'd straightened his jacket. "I'd like to know who he is," I said, "and what his actual interest in my wife was." Sherwood had a private investigator on it before lunch. I went back to the office and tried to work. Around 2 in the afternoon, our receptionist Blythe appeared in my doorway. Blythe had been with the company 3 years and had developed a reliable instinct for the difference between a routine interruption and something else. "There's a woman here to see you," she said. "No appointment. She says her name is Georgia and that you'd know what it's about." I went still. Georgia Ashford. I hadn't seen her in person since a Christmas visit to Portland when she was 23. She would be 31 now. I found her in the lobby near the window, arms at her sides, chin up, with the expression of someone who has already cried as much as she intends to in public. She had her father's eyes. That same clear, direct look that had once made grown men choose their words more carefully. "Georgia," I said. "Mr. Colby." She gave a small, effortful smile. "I'm sorry to come without calling." "Don't apologize. Come to my office." She got to it without preamble, which was another thing she'd clearly inherited. Her mother, Vivian Ashford, had been diagnosed 14 months ago. She'd finished 2 rounds of treatment. The third had stopped being effective in September. The doctors were now talking in terms of weeks. "She asked for you," Georgia said. "She said if I was going to tell you, I should do it in person this week. She didn't want you to miss the chance." I looked at my desk, the blueprints, the schedule, the bid due Thursday. "I'll leave tomorrow morning," I said. She looked briefly startled, then she nodded. "She'll be glad." I'd been sending money to Vivian Ashford every month since 2006. Not a token amount. I'd set it up through Sherwood's office, through a small trust with a name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know the story. The Colonel had done something for me that no one had done before. He'd taken the sum of my history and told me it was enough to build on, not something to bury. After he was gone, taking care of his family felt less like charity and more like a debt I could at least partially pay. Georgia flew back that evening. I drove her to the airport and we talked in the car about Portland, about her mother's garden, about her 2 brothers, Hayes, the eldest, a civil engineer, and Finn, who was finishing a PhD. At the terminal, she turned before getting out. "He talked about you, you know," she said. "My father. Mom showed me an old letter once. He said you were the finest soldier he'd ever commanded, who also nearly got himself thrown out more times than anyone on record." I laughed for the first time in 2 days. I flew to Portland the next morning. Georgia was waiting outside arrivals. She drove me to a quiet neighborhood near the river, a house with a big oak in the front yard, and wind chimes on the porch that were probably older than either of us. Vivian Ashford was propped up in a hospital bed set up in the sunroom, facing the back garden. She was smaller than I remembered. But when she turned her head and saw me come through the door, her face did something that nearly undid me completely. "Rex Colby," she said, in a voice that had gotten quieter but not weaker. "You took long enough." "I had to find a parking space," I said. She laughed. It turned into a cough. I pulled a chair to the side of her bed, sat down, took her hand, and we stayed like that for a while without needing to fill the air. Over the next 10 days, I slept in the guest room. Hayes and Finn had cleared out for me and helped where I could. Driving to the pharmacy, sitting with Vivian in the afternoons while Georgia caught a few hours of sleep, fixing a kitchen cabinet whose hinge had been loose for 2 years. The brothers and I developed an easy rhythm. Some evenings we sat on the porch after Vivienne was asleep and didn't say much. Georgia and I talked more. In the mornings over coffee. On walks down to the river in the late afternoon when she needed air. She ran the operations side of a nonprofit that built affordable housing along the Pacific coast. The overlap with my line of work didn't escape either of us. "Did you know," she asked me one evening, sitting on the porch steps with her mug between both hands, "that it was you sending the money all this time?" "I was never sure," I said. "I assumed she knew, but I never confirmed it." "She figured it out the second year," Georgia said. "She said she decided not to say anything because she thought you'd stop if she acknowledged it." She paused. "She was right, wasn't she?" "Probably," I admitted. She looked down at her mug for a moment. "I used to wonder about you. I had this picture of who you were from Dad's stories. Then when you came to visit that Christmas, you were so quiet. Nothing like what I expected." "What did you expect?" She smiled. "I don't know. Less quiet." Sherwood called on the 8th day. Claudia had filed a countercomplaint for infidelity, naming 2 women, Vivienne Ashford of Portland, and a former nonprofit project collaborator named Tilda Crane I'd worked alongside 3 years ago. Sherwood strongly suspected the source was Darian. "He dug up the trust payments," Sherwood said. "Found your connection to the Ashford family and the Crane project through company records, stitched it together, and sold it to your wife as a pattern of affairs." And she believed him. "People believe what they're afraid not to," Sherwood said carefully. "What do we do?" "Full documentation of everything. The trust, the Colonel's service record, the history of your connection to this family, the Crane project timeline with 0 personal contact outside of work. None of it holds up." He paused. "And my investigator has found something about Darian's own conduct that your wife's attorney may not know." "Tell me." "He's been representing a commercial development client, a project called Meridian Towers, while conducting this affair. He steered the deal through Claudia's firm in a way that benefited him personally. Conflicts of interest that were never disclosed. It's a bar complaint at minimum." He paused again. "Rex, is there anything about Meridian Towers that might be relevant from your side?" I sat on the edge of the guest room bed and looked at the wall for a moment. "Pull up the project," I said. "Specifically the land parcel on the northeast corner of the development. Colby Development purchased the ground lease on that parcel 18 months ago. We've been sitting on it. I let that land. Get me the documentation." Vivienne passed on a Thursday, just as the November light went gold on the garden she'd tended for 30 years. All 4 of us were with her. Georgia held one hand, Hayes held the other, and Finn had his arm around his brother's shoulder. I stood a little apart, feeling like what I was. Not quite family, not quite not. At the end, Vivienne turned her head toward me. I leaned in close. "She's a good woman," she whispered. "Don't be an idiot about it." I didn't trust myself to speak. I nodded. After the arrangements were made and the house had gone quiet, Georgia and I walked down to the river and sat on a bench without talking. At some point, she leaned against my shoulder, and I put my arm around her, and we stayed that way while the sky darkened over the water. "I don't know what to do now," she said quietly. It wasn't quite a question. "You'll figure it out," I said. "You're an Ashford." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then she turned and looked at me, and in the fading light she had so much of her father in her face that it stopped me for a second. "What about you?" she said. "What do you do now?" I didn't have a clean answer. I was still technically married. Still in the middle of something unfinished. But sitting there by the river, I understood something I hadn't been fully willing to admit before. Whatever happened with the divorce, I wanted to know where Georgia Ashford was going next. "I'll figure it out," I said. She held my gaze, then looked back at the river. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll wait." I flew home the following week. Within 10 days of Sherwood filing our response, the complete documentation, the Colonel's service record, the notarized history of the Ashford Trust, the Tilda Crane project timeline. Claudia's attorney stopped returning calls with the same urgency. The Meridian Towers situation played out quietly the way the best leverage always does. When Darian's client discovered the ground lease on the northeast parcel was held by Colby Development, and that the owner of Colby Development was the husband of the attorney handling their deal, the project stalled completely. The conflicts of interest Sherwood had documented went to the state bar. Darian's name appeared in the subsequent investigation. He didn't lose his license immediately, those things take time. But he lost the deal, the client, and the standing he'd spent years constructing. The divorce was finalized on a cold morning in February in a conference room with beige walls and bad coffee. Claudia sat across from me, her attorney beside her, in a way that felt more like support than strategy. She had asked to speak with me before we signed. I agreed. When her attorney stepped out, she looked at me for a long moment. The composure was still there. She'd never lose that entirely, but something behind it had shifted. "I should have asked you," she said, "about the payments, about the trust. I should have come to you directly instead of—" She stopped. "Instead of believing him," I said. "I thought I had proof. I thought I'd finally found the answer to something I'd been afraid of for years. You were always so contained. I never really knew where I stood with you." That wasn't entirely wrong, and I knew it. "So when someone handed you an answer, you took it," I said, "even if it meant not asking me." "Yes," her voice was level barely. I leaned forward. "Claudia, I would have explained everything. The Colonel, what he meant to me, what I owed his family, all of it. If you'd asked me, once, just once, I would have sat down and told you the whole story. That was supposed to be what 7 years meant." She pressed her lips together and looked at the table. "The woman you named in that filing," I said, "Vivienne Ashford died 3 weeks ago. She was already dying when all of this started. I went to Portland because she was the closest thing to a mother I'd had since I was 15, and her daughter needed someone there who still remembered her father. I let that settle into the air between us. That's what Darian sold you. That's what you chose over asking me." The room was quiet. Then quietly, "I'm sorry, Rex." I pushed back my chair and stood up. I'd said what I came to say. "Take care of yourself," I told her, and I meant it. Walking out of that building into the February cold, I felt something I hadn't expected. Lighter. Not happy. Not triumphant. Just lighter, the way you feel when you've been carrying something heavy for so long you'd stopped noticing the weight. I drove home, changed my clothes, and called Georgia. She picked up on the second ring. "It's done," I said. "How do you feel?" I looked out the kitchen window at the mountains, holding the last of the afternoon light on their western faces. That particular shade of amber that only happens in winter. "Like I want to come back to Portland," I said. "If you're still there." A pause. Not hesitation, consideration. She'd always been her father's daughter that way. "I was starting to wonder," she said, "if you were going to be an idiot about it after all." I laughed. It came easy that time. "Give me a week," I said. "I have a project to close out." "I know," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand, not thinking about anything particular. Just the mountains and the quiet and the odd feeling that the part of my life I'd thought was settled had turned out to be only the first half. My Uncle Chet used to say the measure of a man isn't how he acts when things go right. It's how he stands when the floor falls out. I used to think he meant hold steady, stay on your feet, don't let anyone see you crack. I understand it differently now. I think he meant something simpler. That when the floor falls out, you find out what you were actually standing on all along. What was real underneath everything else you'd built. For me, it turned out to be something I'd been tending quietly for 20 years without quite knowing why. A debt I'd tried to pay in monthly installments to a man who believed in me before I'd given him much reason to. A family I'd supported from a distance without letting myself claim. A woman who had her father's eyes and her mother's patience and the sense to say, the first time I walked through her door, that she would wait. Some things take a long time to become what they always were.